right. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, we're good. And the slides almost work. Well, I'll begin with what's most important, which is gratitude. One, that simulation was fun. Table 24 is definitely going to take the prize home. Two, to the Shared Value Summit for inviting me back a second year. To Barclays, our co-founders at Unreasonable Impact, for giving me a little bit of time on this stage to share with this room what we do, and most importantly to each of you, for lending me your ears, your minds, your hearts, hopefully, for the next 30 minutes. I'm going to kick this off with about 10 minutes, describing what it is we're aspiring to do with Unreasonable Impact, why it is we created this partnership, what our vision is for the world around rallying behind entrepreneurs, and then we're going to have a panel conversation, as was introduced, talking about the role of capital and investment to catalyze companies that can hopefully bend history in the right direction. So now, before we look at the future, I think it's wise to always look backwards at the past. This is a shot, some of you may have seen this. Tony Seba, the entrepreneur and author, first introduced this to me. It's an image of Fifth Avenue in New York, 1900 Easter morning. So the question is, if you look at Fifth Avenue, 1900 Easter morning, can you see the automobile in this photo? There is an automobile here, I promise. There's one. It's hidden there in the corner. Now, if we fast forward, 1913 Easter morning, Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. The question is, can you see the horse-drawn buggy in this image? There is one. It's right there. 13 years, 81% market adoption of one of the most disruptive technologies of our time. People who say that disruption isn't real, they haven't looked at the historical trends. And this is in spite of and despite unbelievable innovation that need to occur. We had to build the entire auto industry from scratch. We had to build road infrastructure from scratch. We had to take a whole generation of workers through complex machinery and the tools that needed to fix those machines. We had to create the assembly line, and we did all of this while we were fighting World War I. Right? What this is known as and how this is best kind of symbolically shown is with the S-curve of adoption. Here you can see the dotted line. This would be the automobile. The solid line here would be the horse-drawn chariot. What typically happens is back in the day, in about 10 to 15 years, you would see a new disruptive technology would hit about 50% market share and then completely take over the market. There's a lot of anxiety today around disruptive advanced technologies, and that's because the rate of adoption of these S-curves has significantly transformed. This is BlackRock's data. It's the largest financial institution of our time. They manage over $6 trillion in assets. Here they're showing the rate of new technological disruptions, these S-curves from 1900 to present day. And what you can see is the S-curves, they're no longer S's. They're literally straight lines. Right? Technological disruption, it's always existed. It's always transformed industry. It's always transformed the very nature of work. But it has absolutely never done it at the rate at which we're seeing today. So there's some downsides to this, but there are also some miraculous upsides, and that's where I want to start. With our partnership that we co-founded, co-created with Barclays called Unreasonable Impact, we're backing some of the most brilliant breakthrough entrepreneurs of our time that are using these disruptive technologies to both solve social and environmental problems, as well as create jobs of tomorrow. And when technology moves this quickly, you see unbelievable breakthroughs. This is a company, Andiamo. They can 3D print prosthetic and orthotic body parts. They're able to do it at 1/10 the cost, 1/100th the speed. They're able to make them beautiful. This is one of our companies growing underground. They are a hydroponic farm under the streets of London. Literally, they took World War II bunkers that were completely vacant, and they've created hydroponic farms underneath the streets of London so that you can get your vegetables within 1 kilometer, about 150 feet below where you're standing. This is AeroFarms also, and you're going to hear a lot more about AeroFarms today, the largest vertical farm in the world. When we're talking about water scarcity, actually my solution for Planet Sapien was give all of the water to David from AeroFarms. They're able to produce the same amount of crop yield with 1 acre that would normally take 390 acres. They do it at 98% less water consumption as regular agriculture. We might also want to give our water to this company. This is River Simple. It's one of the most efficient hydrogen cell-powered vehicles in the world. They're able to get 300 miles to 1 liter of hydrogen. The only thing that comes out, it is a what? The only thing that comes out of the exhaust pipe is purified water. It's hot. You could literally drink tea out of it. I don't recommend that you do, but when we look at the future of transportation, it's not just EVs. We also believe it's hydrogen cell-powered vehicles. This is biocarbon engineering, a drones company, Drones for Good. The drone here on the right, it actually has an air gun in it. This is the prototype. They could plant 100,000 trees in one day with one operator. They're trying to terraform Earth. Their goal is to plant 100 billion trees within the next decade. They are a profitable business. This is General Fusion. If we think about the future of energy and renewable energy, if we can crack hot fusion, for anybody who knows about hot fusion, in essence, you recreate the center of the sun in a stable environment. It's a big if we can crack hot fusion, that means unlimited clean energy for the world for at least 1 million years. This company is trying to do it. When we first started working with them, they could get plasma to about 10 million degrees centigrade. They now can get it to 38 million degrees centigrade. If you cross 50, you get sustained hot fusion. Here's a company, Zero Mass Water. It's atmospheric water generation. They're using solar panels, and this shows kind of the interior artistic view. But they use a solar panel. You don't need to plug it into anything. They're able to pull water out of the atmosphere. They can create 40 liters of clean drinking water every day with 3% humidity. It works in deserts. They're selling into 18 countries. Right? All of these technologies, these are all real. These are all viable companies. They're all in market today, and that's because that rate of technological disruption and the affordability of advanced tech is accelerating more than we've ever seen it before. Right? But there is clearly a downside to the rate of this level of technological adoption. And when we talk about shared value, I think there's no more important stage to look at this statistic than with the room here. A study recently found, and we all know this stat, but I think it's powerful when you read it up on the screen, the 3 wealthiest people in the United States have more wealth than the bottom 50% of this country. Now, what's scary about this number is it's being exacerbated with this statistic. We all know this. By 2035, Oxford predicts that nearly 50% of the jobs that exist today, this is in the United States, will no longer exist. Right? So we were privileged, our company, Unreasonable Group, to team up with a team at Barclays and launch Unreasonable Impact because we both shared a belief in this, which is entrepreneurship. This word, remarkably hard to spell. I've written it thousands of times that I still don't know if the E goes before the U or after the U, whatever it might be. That's because its roots are French. It could be interpreted to mean to take into one's own hands. We're betting on what we believe are the most impactful, the most shared value-aligned entrepreneurs on the planet, because entrepreneurs, where most of us see market failures, right, they have a curiously warped perspective. They're the exact same thing, they see a market opportunity. Entrepreneurs also are economic engines of industry and of job creation. But the entrepreneurs that we're aligning with, we realize that all entrepreneurs, all businesses, we all design solutions to problem sets. But there are some entrepreneurs who dedicate their life's work to solving the hardest problem sets. We heard a little bit about that with BD early on the stage today. We choose to work with entrepreneurs, and pardon my French, but who are solving what we refer to as BFPs. Stands for big fucking problems. There's no better way to put it. And what I want to do, before we welcome the panelists up on stage, is introduce you to one of those entrepreneurs with a video. This is a never before, Mark was telling me earlier, never before shown screening of a new video. We actually partnered with Vice to launch a new series covering the stories of some of these entrepreneurs, because most of the world doesn't know that these stories are even real, that they're even possible. So it's going to be about a 4-minute clip, and then I'll round it out, and then we'll have the panelists come up, and hopefully the volume here works. We'll see.
The amount of available farmland in the world is getting smaller and smaller. The amount of food we need to produce is getting bigger and bigger. The populations are getting bigger and bigger. By the UN's estimates, we need over 50% more food by 2050. So we need a new paradigm of how we're going to feed our planet. I'm David Rosenberg. I co-founded and lead AeroFarms.
I'm Mark Oshima. I'm one of the co-founders and chief marketing officer.
We're here in Newark, New Jersey, which is our headquarters. AeroFarms is the largest vertical farm in the world. We've grown about 400 varieties of leafy greens to date. Our productivity is 390 times higher than a field farmer. So 1 acre at AeroFarms, you would need 390 acres. So we grow a plant in 14 days, what typically takes about 30 to 45 days in the field.
We can grow plants and understand plants better than anyone because we're managing the entire system. We're looking at the seeds, the genetics, we're thinking about the growing system and the environment. We're leveraging things like machine vision, machine learning, even AI to really understand those plants and develop what we call growing algorithms. And then we think about things that have gone and disappeared with traditional field farming, things like flavor, taste, textures, bringing back heirloom varieties, really celebrating a real rich biodiversity.
This is a mustard green. You can see the contrast right next to a romaine. In this area, there's actually a mist where we are misting the root structure. Roots want oxygen, leaves want carbon dioxide. So besides giving them supplemental CO2, we are also giving them very specific intensities and frequencies for what the plants want.
At AeroFarms, we emphasize a culture of challenging, and we look for people that have thick enough skin to be challenged. We've been able to broaden our lens of that workforce and taken people with a background of incarcerations, offering them a way to earn a wage, care for their families, and be productive to society.
Today's afternoon quote is, close your eyes to the past ends and open your heart to new beginnings. My name is Samantha Evans Torr. I'm born and raised in Newark. I work at AeroFarms. I am a horticulture technician. It's like taking care of your child. You know, just want to make sure they're getting the right light and the right amount of water to grow properly. I'm a recovering addict. I have 11 years clean. After going to state prison, when I came out, I was having issues with getting jobs because of my background. Got hooked up with the Greater Newark Conservancy, which set up me an interview here. When I got here and I found out what all AeroFarms was about, I was like, wow. We grow arugula, pak choi, watercress, ruby streaks, and red romaine, my favorite. My grandmother, she used to have a garden in our backyard where we had to dig the dirt and we had to make sure we sprayed the water hose and stuff like that, give it a lots of water because the sun would basically dry it out. I love it here, and I love the fact that I'm feeding not just my community, I'm feeding the world. This is where I'm building my career path.
The scary part of climate change is how some of it may be irreversible. It makes one think about future generations, about my kids. We really owe it to ourselves, owe it to them, to leave the world better, not worse. We need to change our behaviors, we need to innovate, and we need to do it fast.
There's a whole stage. I almost ran into that when I turned around. So we're going to hear from David in just a moment, but his story really embodies what it is we're after in this partnership. It's supporting entrepreneurs, individuals, and companies like David and like AeroFarm. Today, over the past 3 years, we supported 94 companies. Across these companies, they've raised just over $2 billion in financing. They've generated just shy of $2 billion in revenue. These are real businesses. They've impacted the lives of well over 150 million individuals in literally nearly every country and territory on the planet. They're supporting over 34,000 jobs directly. And since we founded the partnership 3 years ago, they've created net new jobs over 20,000. We are remarkably grateful to have co-founded this initiative with Barclays, and what it has proven to us, and hopefully what will prove to the world in this conversation, is that this is a myth. And if any room knows that, it's the shared value room, right? It's not a spectrum. And on one end you have, let me get the right end here, making a lot of money, and on one end you have making a lot of positive impact in the world. If we're honest about it, it's more complicated than that, right? It's an X and Y axis. And I like to make this a little more real and try to use your vantage point. So if we look at the top left, that blue dot, that's somebody who's making a lot of money, not doing much good in the world. So know your audience, that might be a bank robber, right? If we move over to the next dot, still up in the top left quadrant, sorry to anybody who's here maybe with Goldman Sachs, but that might be a Goldman Sachs investment banker. And if we drop down to the bottom right, somebody's doing a remarkable amount of good, not making much money, that might be a Red Cross volunteer. Right above that, you have an elementary school teacher in an inner city. Above that, that's typically the only dot here in the do well and do good quadrant. That's typically where we think about social innovation or social impact or even shared value. And what we want to prove to this partnership, and hopefully in the conversation that we're going to have on the panel today, is that there is a dot that is in the top right. And this is grounded in the belief of Unreasonable Impact that the future titans of industry, that they are the Davids, that the most lucrative companies, you can't just do well and do good, you'll outperform the market by maximizing the amount of good that you do. And we think the 94 companies that we have the privilege of supporting embody just that. I will close by rationalizing a seemingly irrational name. The individual behind me, this is the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, and he's famous for saying that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in adapting the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable person. If George Bernard Shaw is right, if all progress depends on unreasonable individuals, then in a world where over 700 million people don't have access to clean drinking water, Planet Sapien is real, right? In a world where over 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day, in a world where preventable diseases like diarrhea kill over 5 million children every single year. In the world that we live in today, if all progress depends on unreasonable people, then we can't afford not to bet on the world's most unreasonable individuals. We believe those people are entrepreneurs, and so this panel is going to be a conversation about betting on entrepreneurs trying to solve the world's hardest problems through investment. So without further ado, we're going to welcome the panelists up to the stage. We have David, Danielle, and Jed. If you all come up here and join me. And I have a little cheat sheet right here. So we're going to start with David, and let's give David a round of applause. You just heard his story, right? So let's just actually so everybody know who's on the panel right now. To the far side, we have Jed, my good friend, who is the head of social impact investing for Barclays. We have Danielle, who's the investment officer with Closed Loop Partners, and then David, who you just heard from, the founder, CEO, or co-founder, CEO of AeroFarms. So David, I wanted to start with not what you do, because we just got a glimpse of that, but why you started the company. This isn't your first company. You could have applied your business acumen to solving any problem. I mean, why AeroFarms? Why was this important to you?
It started with some of the macro trends, specifically in water, just appreciating that the world's fresh water is getting more and more scarce. And looking at where water's applied, I was on something called the Global Agenda Council of Water Security for the World Economic Forum, and I realized, or I saw the data that about 70% of our fresh water goes to agriculture, and about 70% of our freshwater contamination comes from agriculture. So it became clear if one wants to help solve water, one needs to look at agriculture. And then as a technology enthusiast at the same time read something called Heitz's Law, analogous to Moore's Law. Moore's Law talks about computing power. Heitz's Law talks about the efficiency of a diode improving by 50% every 3 years. And thinking about, with the lowering cost of LEDs, light-emitting diodes, what industries could that impact? And I came to the realization that indoor farming, vertical farming, is one of those. And that was in about 2011, right at the tipping point where the economics didn't work, but just following Heitz's Law, realizing it could have a big impact. So the purpose, if you will, was to build farms in cities all over the world so everyone has access to fresh, safe, healthy food. And actually our purpose has changed since then, has gone broader, but that was the genesis of it.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about that, the broader purpose. I mean, as you dove into vertical farming, hydroponic farming, I think you realize there are applications beyond just food for the work that you're doing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So we've now grown about 700 different types of plants. And we
believe we could grow anything, it doesn't mean we grow everything. So we look to see where there's a problem that needs to be solved, and are we in a unique position to solve that problem. So for example, we ask, is pesticide free of benefit? Is fresh of benefit? Are there issues with 365-day access or consistent quality? Or can we amplify, we could change nutrient density, vitamin A, B, C, D, antioxidants, just like if we as humans eat differently, if the plants get different nutrients, micronutrients, spectrum, et cetera. So we ask ourselves what problems are there to solve, and again, are we in a unique position to solve it? And then from my last company was a nanotech day company. From my nanotech days, just spending a lot of time in the lab, realized that in order to perform true scientific experimentation, one needs to isolate variables, test assumptions. It's almost impossible to do that in open field agriculture. Even in greenhouse agriculture, there are too many uncontrolled variables. So we're in a unique position to do just that, isolate variables, test assumptions, and get an understanding of plant science that's to new heights. So the change, the pivot in our purpose was, yes, it is on the broader scale to grow plants for the betterment of humanity. Yep. And then more specifically, part of it is to take that understanding of plant science to whole new levels, appreciating that the world is relatively ignorant on what makes a plant grow. You talk to seed breeders and say why within a same lot some seeds worked and some seeds don't, and they really don't know. And it's because the environment does different things. So take that understanding of plant science to new levels. Next, it's to be better farmers. And by that, it's the integration of plant science with how to deliver a specification to the plant. So we have plant physiologists, plant pathologists, molecular biologists, microbiologists that understand what the plant wants. And then they interact with mechanical engineers, structural, lighting, electrical, PLC, process, industrial, all these different engineers, all these different quality assurance people, operations people to discuss what best way to deliver that specification to the plant. And so to take an understanding of plant science, be better farmers by delivering the specification to the plant, and then understanding, back to my earlier statement, what problems are we in a unique position to solve. And if you think of that bigger statement, grow plants for the betterment of humanity, it allows us a much broader reach where today, while a big part of our business is growing plants, selling produce to people to enjoy, it's also to understand where we could collaborate, advance, accelerate innovation cycles, and it's not just food directly, but it's food or plants as an ingredient, fruits or vegetables, or it could be as an input to pharmaceutical, nutraceutical, cosmeceutical. If you think of like a lotion and you want it to say, or you want to see pesticide free, for example, and if there are issues in that supply chain, how do we collaborate with innovators or CPG companies, whatever it is, to understand where the challenges in their supply chain, and again, are we in a unique position to solve them? And broadening that purpose, we get about 1,700 resumes a month for people that want to join our journey. And I'd say the biggest positive benefit of being a purpose-led company is just getting brilliant people to join us and advance our goals.
Brilliant. The last question will be a quick one. Part of the conversation we're having here is resources and investment. Can you share, and it could be a bucket too if you don't want this precise amount, but how much investment have you guys raised to date?
About 100 million.
Yeah, 100 million. Brilliant. Okay, so that's perfect transition to an investor who's right next to you, Danielle. Danielle, you're the investment officer with Closed Loop. I would love to hear, Closed Loop is really interesting because in some ways you're bridging that divide between entrepreneurs and multinationals too. Can you share in 60 seconds or so what Closed Loop does, and then we're going to jump into what you look for in your portfolio as well and a couple other things.
Yeah, so Closed Loop Partners is an investment firm that was initially created to solve for a major problem in society, which is that of we create a lot of waste in the production of things, whether it's food or textiles or our consumer products. And there's a lot of waste in that supply chain, and we're sending it all to landfill. That's a problem both on the initial upstream end of we need to extract new resources constantly in order to supply all those new things that we're making for everyone. And then we're not utilizing any of these waste streams that we're putting into landfill at the end of the day. So The initial Closed Loop Partners was started actually by a collaboration, a pre-competitive collaboration between major consumer product companies, Walmart, Nestle, Unilever, Coke, Pepsi, P&G. There are 13 major companies that have gotten together around our table to say, we can't solve this problem alone. We actually need to work together. And we need to do that in a pre-competitive way. And we're going to do that through Closed Loop Partners. So Closed Loop Partners initially was an investment firm funded to put money towards recycling infrastructure in the US economy. So we lend money to municipalities, to private operators to enhance recycling infrastructure. As a result of doing a lot of that work, we also created Closed Loop Ventures, which is an early stage investment fund dedicated to catalyzing innovations that can help us reduce waste across various supply chains. We spend a lot of time in food waste and agriculture. And then we also have a private equity fund that invests larger amounts of capital into this kinds of infrastructure. In addition to that, we have a consultancy and advisory services business that does a lot of pre-competitive collaborations and research around circular economy issues, this idea of how do we reduce waste streams across these really complex and integrated supply chains that I'm sure many of you in this room know much more about than I do. But these are big problems, these are big systemic problems that we can't solve alone, that investors can't solve alone, that entrepreneurs can't solve alone, that multinationals can't solve alone. And so we try to bring everyone around the same table to do that from both a financing perspective and a collaboration perspective.
And can you share just one real tactical example of that where it took investment and multinationals and the entrepreneur to all come together to help bring something to scale?
Yeah, so one really great example of that is probably to take you on a bit of a journey through what's happening in the recycling space today. So everyone, you make your consumer packaged goods, whether it's a Tide bottle or a Nestle water bottle, and at the end of that, at the end of your use, you throw it in the recycling bin, and hopefully there's a recycling bin available for you to throw that into, right? In much of the country, that doesn't actually even exist. So after it goes into the recycling bin, it gets aggregated with all the other plastic water bottles and sent to what's called a MRF, a material recovery facility. At those MRFs, there are lots of conveyor belts and sortation machines. Often it's actually done by hand. So you have people who are sitting at a conveyor belt saying, okay, that bottle goes here, that bottle goes there. It's a largely miserable job. And it's really hard to get people to show up to work every day. What happens in those streams, because it's manual and by hand, people aren't showing up to work, a lot of times the bales that are supposed to be purely your Nestle water bottles at the end of the day and other what are called PET water bottles end up being contaminated. And then that gets sold into the market of folks who want to buy PET, right, and turn it into its next life. We used to send all of that material to China. Recently, China put up regulation that said, the bales that you're sending us are actually too contaminated. You're really just sending us a lot of trash. We don't want that anymore. So what that means is that the recycling industry in the US has been faced with this challenge of now where do I put my bales that are contaminated as one question, where can I still sell that? And then as another question, how do I improve my infrastructure so that I can actually have less contaminated bales, more high quality product to sell into that market and to actually be able to reuse that PET. This is a petroleum-based product. There's a lot of value in that. You can turn it back into oil, you could turn it back into plastic, you could turn it into a lot of the clothes that we're all wearing. There are many, many uses for that PET. So Closed Loop Fund, the investment vehicle that's funded by all of the multinationals, some of whom are in this room, lends money to those material recovery facilities, those MRFs, to upgrade their equipment, to install better technology that creates better sortation economics. Closed Loop Ventures has invested in an artificially intelligent robot that can actually read what's going down the recycling line and pick it out with a robotic arm. It's got 98% efficiency. It performs incredibly well. It shows up to work every day. And that robot, and there are other robots that are out there, but that robot and other robotic systems are now being installed in MRFs across the country. And so that's an example of how kind of closed loop ventures can work with the infrastructure that these multinationals are helping to fund to create those closed loop economies.
Perfect example. So last, but the farthest thing from least, is my friend and co-conspirator, Jed, who, when we started this partnership with Barclays about 3 years ago, there was nobody in the bank with your title. There was nobody in the investment bank who was heading up impact investing. Would love to hear, Jed, from you, because how I refer to our partnership, Unreasonable Impact, is I never say sponsored by, because it's not sponsored by, it's co-created. Why is this important? To anybody who might be a skeptic in the room, why is this important to Barclays? Why are you supporting companies like David's and others?
Yeah, of course, and thank you for the kind words. It's something, I like to tell people, I think I have the best job at the bank. It's a big bank, but I feel it's the best. So my role, I work in the investment bank, and generally the investment banker strategy is advising companies on capital raising and strategy. But I have a specific focus on social impact businesses. And this is not something we necessarily created to generate more impact. This is something that was really business driven. And so as you talk to David and some of the companies Danielle has supported, we find a lot of the most exciting and fast growing and innovative companies are often the ones having the most purpose driven motivations. And they have the technologies or they have the business models that is both profit driven but also having a really strong positive impact. And it's not just the entrepreneurs themselves and their talent and their ability to use new technology. It's really a whole ecosystem at play. There are investors like Close Loop and others, new pools of capital that are specifically focused on this. A lot of the Fortune 500 companies have initiatives around innovation or corporate venture that are supporting these as well. So for us, we're thinking about how we can really have an impact in this space and what's the role of a bank in trying to support these companies. And we felt essentially applying our investment banking model that we use with large companies, we could take that experience and expertise and apply it to these purpose-driven companies. And maybe just one quick example, and I'm sure everyone saw this last week, the Beyond Meat initial public offering priced, which is the plant-based beverage company. It had 600 investors, it was 30 times oversubscribed, and it was the top performing IPO on the year. And so you could say, at first, this is purely based, it sort of illustrates how there's really a business rationale for us at the bank of supporting these companies because they're doing well and doing good, thanks to the charts.
You're like the blue dot in the top right.
Trying to.
That's your aspirational job.
Yeah.
Maybe one last question, Jed, and then a question for the group, and we'll open it. But I get why it's important to Barclays. Why is this important to you?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I think a little bit about David and your video and how you're helping sort of the community and next generations. I think that's very important. I had historically worked with the renewable energy sector specifically, and we worked on an offering for a company called Azure Power that some people may know. It's an Indian solar company that listed in the US. And just as they articulated their message to US investors about the number of people without electricity in India and the ability of this sort of new technology to really make a difference in people's lives, it was just incredibly powerful. And so it's nice to be talking a little bit about fulfillment and satisfaction. The ability to combine sort of what my historical expertise was in finance and apply it to really purpose-driven companies and helping them succeed is a great way to sort of spend my career.
Brilliant, thank you, Jed. A confession for the room of the stats that I showed on the screen earlier with the billions in financing and revenue and the hundreds of millions of people impacted. I had a conversation with a friend a while back, and she said that there's that expression, those who can't do, teach. And I rebutted and I said, those who can't do or teach, they do what we do. And in essence, our job is to create the conditions for unlikely productive collisions between ideas and people that wouldn't normally forge. And I think this room is perfectly suited for that. So my last question to each of you, and maybe in like 30 seconds, is how can this room collaborate with you on your journey? Let's start with you, David. We'll go in the same order.
Well, for us, a couple points. One is capital. So from a project financing, we get equity capital, which is answer that. The question of the 100 million is the equity capital. Then there's project financing, And that, I would say, is the gap in our financial system, where an innovator like ourselves at AeroFarms, a traditional senior debt lender wants a track record. And if we're innovating and we build a $50 million project, we don't have the history to get true senior debt. And this is a role where maybe impact investors could play. That's one side. And then the other quick side is we don't know what problems to solve, so we try and communicate. We're here. We're good farmers. We're good plant scientists. If people know ag-related problems that need solutions, we want to collaborate them and figure out both from a purchasing standpoint, customer standpoint, but also an innovation cycle standpoint.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Danielle?
So I think capital is one way to participate. I think looking internally to your organizations and really thinking about your own supply chain and where you can either procure more sustainable ingredients or even like in the recycling industry, capital from the private markets will flow into recycling projects if corporations sign long-term offtake agreements for recycled PET. There's a huge benefit to you guys to doing that, similar to in the renewable energy world. If you can secure a fixed price for the long term, you're reducing the volatility that's otherwise, fluctuates with oil, right? So it's minor changes like that, and I'm sure most of you don't sign long-term offtake agreements today. It's typically not standard practice among corporations, but it's something that is really important for innovations to scale. Again, private capital will flow into even early stage projects or unproven projects if they know that offtake is guaranteed. Other supply chain innovations that you can make, again, sourcing from different places, sourcing from more sustainable production, whether that's local ag or it's renewable textiles. We're looking at a company right now that's making apparel out of algae, right? As opposed to cotton, right? There are so many innovations out there, and I think being willing to take risks and trying out some of those early innovations is incredibly powerful. I love the kind of Whole Foods model. I think this hasn't happened so much recently, but Whole Foods used to help early stage food entrepreneurs pilot in specific stores, right? And then slowly expand with them. And that's really powerful because no early stage entrepreneur is ready to go from 0 to 1,000 overnight, but they can go from 0 to 10 and 10 to 100 and 100 to 1,000. And so if anyone in this room is willing to help those early stage entrepreneurs along that journey and be patient with them, but know that when you guys reach 1,000, that's going to be incredibly powerful. That's hugely impactful.
Jed, you have two panelists who need capital, so you still have a job to do.
Good.
But how can this room help you and help Barclays?
Yeah, I think your point is a good one. I think a lot of companies think that capital is maybe the only way to help some of these businesses, and there are a lot of other options in terms of helping develop a prototype or being an off-taker or announcing a joint venture. So continue to think creatively about ways to help some of these entrepreneurs is a great one. And then I think the other point I would make, and this is more generally not necessarily Barclays specific, is just be advocates in your companies internally. I think it sometimes people I think expect or think that the concept of being able to do well and do good is very commonplace, and everyone already fully appreciates that. But I continually to talk to people, and it's not as well understood. So being advocates for purpose-driven companies and for shared value and helping to spread the message, I think, is incredibly important because there's definitely still work to be done, and particularly some of the larger, more traditional industries.
I think, unfortunately, I mismanaged time a little bit, and we need to move on to Michael Porter is the next session. But what I will say is we have a core belief that business isn't business, business is people. And it's been a privilege to share the stage with these three individuals. I'd love to give them a very loud, rowdy round of applause.